introduction to the 6th and final episode of The Art of Bridging. Whether you've been with us since episode 1 or you're just joining us now, we're glad that you've found your way here. This episode is going to be a bit different in shape from the other ones. It's going to be in 3 parts. We're going to start with a recap of the story of our bridging so far. And after that, we'll have a moment of honesty about some of the parts of the project that were more challenging and what we might be able to learn from those bits. The lesser seen underside of the bridges that we've been building, perhaps. In the 3rd and final part, we're going to hear from lots of people who've been involved in Distant Voices or in the Vox Unbound community, telling us about their visions for bridges and what the land on the other side of the bridge might look like. Their reflections are by turns poetic, philosophical, quirky, and subversive. And they give us a place to land. And along the way, of course, there'll be plenty of music. So let's kick off with a recap of the story so far. Episode 1 was called The Currents. And in it, we started to imagine returning after imprisonment as being a bit like crossing a river full of dangerous currents. We heard from Ian and Fergus about some of the many ways in which prison causes harm and disconnection and disintegration.
There's relationships that will break down because of prison. Getting separated from your kids, it takes a toll. Visiting people in prison takes a toll. You're going to have a quick half hour or 40 minutes or whatever it might be. And it's then that separation. You're going your way, they're going back to a life that you're not part of. So I think it destroys relationships more than strengthens them.
I'm holding on to autopilot for tonight. Autopilot doesn't choose. Autopilot's got it all mapped out.
If somebody's been in prison, even for a short time, it changes them. And then how are they going to get back out? A changed person, not always for the better, mentally. You almost definitely will be institutionalised. You know, you've got to learn to become a prisoner. How do you unlearn how to become a prisoner? A thing that's never ever spoken about when they're talking about rehabilitation.
I am more than a number. I am more than a prisoner. I am more than a judgment in a courtroom saga.
I've been kind of in and around criminal justice for 30 years, trying to make it a bit better in various ways, but I think one of the things that Distant Voices has taught me is that it needs to be much, much more fundamental than that. Like, we have to really go back to first principles and start again. The house is built on the wrong foundations, and redecorating the rooms isn't going to make anything better.
Autopilot doesn't choose. Autopilot's got it all mapped out.
Episode 2 was called The Stepping Stones, and in it we chatted with Martin, Phil and Louis about writing songs in prison. And we explored some of the complex ways that people in prison express protest and care, laying stepping stones of survival and connection for themselves and others around them.
Prison was home for them, and thinking about sort of coming home after prison was actually something that was really painful because it seemed so impossible and so far off. So basically they wanted to make a song about the prison being home, and like they had this vision from the start of it being played on the prison radio, with the idea of like everyone dancing in their cells. And I thought this was really beautiful. It seemed like this gesture of care and solidarity with the other prisoners who they were unlikely to meet, you know.
Welcome to the Queen's Hotel. Here's some rules to fit in well. Follow these to the book, or watch out for that left-hand hook. Don't tell all your secrets at the start, 'cause it could be used rip you apart. If we are happy or sad, you can never tell. 'Cause for us it's home, and for some it's hell. Watch the penguins run for the riot bell. 'Cause we're living it up in the Queen's Hotel.
Yeah, a lot of it's fairly familiar, and plus obviously there's a lot of humour in it, and for us there's a lot, we tended to try and make things as funny as we could, even though we're in a shitty place, we still try to make the best things. So yeah, I think there's a connect to it a lot.
But we're living it up in the Queen's Hotel.
Episode 3 was called The Foundations. With input from Sharon, Oliver, Colleen and Gus Bear, we talked about some work that we did as part of Distant Voices with local communities in the north of Scotland on themes of addiction and recovery. We heard stories of taking Distant Voices songs on the road, and we reflected together on identity, inequality, fear, hope and stigma. We imagined connected and supportive communities being like solid foundations for bridges.
So we wanted to link in with communities to try and talk about drug and alcohol harm, talk about recovery, that people do go on to recover, and that we should all play a part in trying to change the language and trying to reduce stigma.
I talk a little bit during the song, about the places that it took me to, and in the end with the bottle and whatever else, and the mask that you would put on to hide from who you are. All I ever knew was I just pressed that button and just kept destroying everything, and I never ever thought that my life would become what it has, and all it was a journey, wasn't it? That first step into that mental hospital, and then every step after that in the right direction led me to where I am today, So, I still think about it sometimes, What if, could I go and have a little bit of this or a wee bit of that? Would it only be once? And I think, am I insane? Do you know what I mean? Look what I've got to lose now, Whereas before, I wouldn't have had what I have today. The trade-off nowadays, there isn't a trade-off, because it would be like stepping in front of a moving car thinking you're not going to get hurt. The consequences are just, it's not something that's in my life anymore. It's not part of who I am, it's who I was.
I started looking at colours again.
Episode 4 was about the columns of our bridge, and it featured poems from a collection written by the Vox Unbound community with Padraig O'Tuma, built from everyday encounters and observations that reflect some of the despair and complexity and hope of new beginnings after prison. Lisa, Alison and Padraig reflected on the potential of poetry and creative collaboration, not only to connect individuals, but also to reach upwards and outwards towards where the power lies.
I suppose I kept on hearing these almost diabolical echoes about the strength of poetry in the stories that people told, as well as great moments of humour and great moments of connection and great moments of survival. That was the creative process for me, to have so many prompts and then to listen to where the room said, this is where the art is.
That's a moment I always love, is just seeing people go, I thought we were very different, and actually there's something here that could connect us.
I stared at the place where the sunlight hits the wall, hoping it would all go away. I was 18 and brave, not 18 in crime.
I'd bought him cufflinks as a thank you. I got them in the shop last month. He said, "What's these?" I said, "If for keeping your sleeves tidy." He said, "No wonder you can't button up your buttons using poofy things like these." We met inside. We never thought we'd see each other here. He said he'd never seen a man more petrified. A little bit of friendship can make a man, He helped me with my buttons, said everything would go okay today. I said, "Okay, let's go."
That's one of the things that I think is so important too about art in response to the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system has so many fixed imaginations about its impact. And art, I think, is always interested in the unexpected curiosities that can arise as a result of a person using their own innate creativity. It is the interruption of creativity and the unexpected nature of possibility that I think is one of art's most audacious actions in the face of systemic violence.
All life, death, does end, and each day dies with sleep.
In episode 5, we met Joe and Gordon, who took us on a behind-the-scenes journey into the complex process of making A Giant on the Bridge, a unique piece of gig theatre. We heard about what happens when restorative justice practices meet songwriting, and about how restorative encounters can shed new light on professional practice in criminal justice social work. We called this episode The Beams because it gives an insight into the act of reaching out across uncertain, conflicted, in-between spaces.
What if we took those songs to a bunch of people who work in and have great experience in fields like restorative justice, but also mediation? What if we took them those songs and we said to them, if these songs were people and you were facilitating a meeting between them to get them to talk, how would you do that?
But there's a place we can live in with asking, with answering, a seat we both sit upon to be listened and to listen.
So I think maybe for me, what I've taken away from Unbound and the core group and Distant Voices is give myself a wee shake, basically, and get back to first principles, the things you maybe did when you first started out your career before you felt so, I wouldn't say burnt out, but you feel you become a bit of a machine, to be honest with you. You can go into automatic pilot a bit too easily. And like I said, my experience at Unbound is maybe just, woke up, is a good way to put it. I woke up a little bit.
We believe we can move from redacted, from flattened people to detail and resolution, filling the silences or leaving them.
So here we are at our 6th and final episode. And so far in this series, we might have given the impression of Distant Voices as a shiny, impressive, successful project. And there is so much to celebrate and be proud of. But there were also plenty of challenges along the way. And if we don't engage with those moments where things didn't work so well or felt messy or conflicted, we're not only being dishonest, we're also missing out on some of the most important learning from the project. So what have we learned, and how might that help others who are involved in collaborative and participatory work like this? Well, what has become clear over the life of the project is that we live in a society full of multiple, overlapping structures and systems that put pressure on people in so many different ways. We've talked a lot here about the criminal justice system and the harm that it causes, but there are other less visible systems that have had an effect on the project. One of these systems is academia. In recent weeks, thousands of academics across the UK have been on strike, in protest not only about massive cuts in pensions, but also the many forms of deepening inequality in the sector. Pay gaps relating to gender, ethnic background or disability, short-term precarious contracts, and unsafe workloads. What does this have to do with Distant Voices? Well, the academic system is increasingly constructed as a numbers game, based on scores and rankings, where you get the most points for something you're seen to have led, or better still, achieved all on your own. This system based on individual merit and demerit, which can determine whether you have a job or not in the future, it doesn't easily accommodate more collective or participatory approaches that try to respect equally the different things that differently placed people bring to the work.
We speak in binary. We speak in footsteps and voltage, silence and static. We speak in electrical language.
The music industry is also a system where you have to play a certain kind of PR game in order to actually get songs to the ears of the public. We've found that the media are interested in individual stories, and the more sensational the better. Sometimes they want to focus on established artists, which risks erasing co-writers who are not professional musicians. And sometimes they want to hear the stories of people only as, quote-unquote, offenders or prisoners, which can be a negative and even dangerous experience that reinforces one-dimensional identities and prevents people from being able to move on. And how do you deal with the differences in power and resources between an academic researcher, an established musician, and a prison-based co-writer and participant? Who owns what they make together, whether it's a song or a research paper? How can all their voices be present in the sharing of what they make together, especially when one of them is locked away? And if you're trying to release songs or writings in order to spark conversations about issues like state punishment, that's a really tricky space to be in. How do you critique and challenge the criminal justice system while continuing to negotiate access to the people inside it?
We're only tackle or we're matter. When we burn, we'll lick the rafters. When we burn.
In Distant Voices, many of these conversations crystallised around unequal power dynamics, caused both by the way society is set up and structured, and by individualised and individualising worldviews. Let's take the example of the Distant Voices core group, a diverse group of people with different connections to the criminal justice system. Did we all have an equal voice in the project? In all honesty, no, we probably didn't. The voices of those of us in professional roles dominated, especially those of us who set everything up and who knew the rules of the research systems that had funded the work and that demanded a particular kind of product for their money. We could and should have taken things slower, listened more, talked less, been less focused on goals, on outputs and the project's impact. But at the same time, we couldn't just ignore the pressure to deliver. We were spending public money after all. And that pressure was most keenly felt by those who had secured the funding, who ultimately carried the can for the project. Timescales too were messy, especially once the dreaded word COVID entered our vocabulary. But even before that, the slow decision-making and heavy bureaucracy of big academia often clashed with the needs and timescales of a small voluntary sector organisation on the ground, surviving on and employing staff using short-term funds, so needing clarity on budgets and plans and staffing hours. Hopefully you're getting the picture. When you take a step back, these problems are largely structural, but in a society where so much is centred on the individual, it's not always easy to recognise this, especially when you're in the middle of it. And part of the work that we need to do is to continue to make all sorts of different structures more visible and audible, and to keep pushing for a different, more equal, more inclusive way of doing things. The tendency to fail to see the power of structures that constrain us, and to see things in terms of the individual over the community, also affects how our society imagines reintegration after prison. Just as crime is framed as an individual choice, so too is reintegration. Prison-based rehabilitation programs mostly centre on individual attitudes and supposed choices, ignoring factors like class or gender or ethnicity, and wider landscapes of poverty, austerity, trauma, stigma and lack of opportunity. The implied message is that it's just a matter of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. This narrative is so dominant and so dishonest and unjust, and it doesn't hold space for our wider collective story and the challenges we need to face together. This also creates an incredibly difficult in-between space for people with experience of prison, in terms of moving on and identity. In Distant Voices and in Vox Unbound, we've seen people struggle with the conflict between wanting to be part of a supportive community, wanting to be involved in bringing change, but feeling that the focus on the criminal justice system is unhelpful for them, narrowing the horizons and pulling back towards a point in the past that they want to move on from. There are lots of cans of worms here that we opened and mixed up. And if we had to sum up our learning from some of these challenges, we'd say, firstly, be wary of narratives and conflicts that focus solely on the individual and don't see the wider structural pressures that people are under. And secondly, recognise and challenge the social systems that prevent people from having equal voices and equal chances to be heard. As we get into the habit of naming and questioning power differentials and imagining how things could be otherwise, we create collective stories that we can all be part of.
As it was, must be difficult. People pulling your strings must be difficult. An elastic band tightening. Remember that bus shelter on a windy day. We'll huddle together, get out of the rain. Under your chin will be a buttercup glow. Burnt toast and coffee will keep us out of the cold.
You might be wondering about the songs you've been hearing throughout this section. Well, I'm glad you asked. Last year, as we continued to wrestle with life under lockdown conditions, the Vox Unbound community, already moving on and growing beyond their involvement in Distant Voices, embarked on a collaborative songwriting experiment. Bringing together musicians, former prisoners, current prisoners, and people who work in criminal justice, we formed small songwriting groups and tried to figure out ways of making together despite all the barriers between us. Before long, the communication lines were buzzing. Over Zoom, WhatsApp, Basecamp, email a prisoner, prison video calls, and even the occasional meeting over a garden gate. And while we were crafting these songs together, we tried to grapple with questions of power and leadership and ownership. What emerged was a series of songs and blog posts documenting this process, and a lot of learning that responds to some of the challenges touched on here. The project was called Sounds of Solidarity, and if you put that in the search box on the Vox Luminous website, you'll find 5 songs and 6 blog posts from the project.
Today is a day of sunshine and taking in the rains. Tomorrow's a day of teaching the importance of delay.
So, it's time to look to the future. In a moment or two, we're going to hear a load of voices, and you'll get a rest from mine. But before I disappear, I just want to say a huge thank you to all the voices we've heard throughout this series. I actually tried to count up the people who've come on for a chat, the co-writers of the songs, and all of our guest listeners. And I gave up counting when I got to 60 people. It's been a massive team effort. And to everyone who has listened and responded and told others about it, thank you. To round things off, we've asked lots of people from Distant Voices and Vox Unbound to finish 2 sentences. The first is, to build bridges, we're going to need... And the second is, On the other side, we're going to find. The voices and reflections that you're about to hear belong to William, Lynn, Lisa, Andy, Fergus, John, Gordon, Stephen, Pat, Colleen, Phil, Mark and Alison. You'll also hear contributions from people who came along to the Distant Voices Festival and made a collaborative poem together, voiced by Louis. And if you hear a bit of background noise, that's because some of these recordings were made at Vox Unbound, with laughter and the clatter of dishes in the background. Once you've heard this patchwork of voices, we'll wrap up the series with one final song. It's called Waiting for the Daylight, and it was sparked by a beautiful photo of birds on a wire that caught everyone's imagination, taken by Martin from the Unbound community. It's a song that holds open that uncertain in-between space, where bridging happens. Thanks for listening.
To build bridges, we're going to need to calm the waters, remove the fences, take the bricks from the walls and lay the foundations. Listen to what's hidden and embrace the new, the strange and the possible. Learn from what's gone before and the knowledge that we only have scratched the surface of our understanding. Reimagine our attitudes to others and the recognition that our environment and life experiences shaped who we are now, but not who we could be. We are not always going to be right and we're not always going to be wrong, but we will always be human.
My bridge would be made of understanding. So where that understanding would lead to is connection. Because in my eyes, every addict's dealing with that situation. Like we're disconnected. So we start off disconnected from ourselves and become disconnected with the wider society that exists. And the reason this disconnection exists is because the actual perception of what we're doing is misunderstood. So everyone actually sees it as an individual problem by someone that is maybe lazy or needs to grow up or, like a myriad of different reasons, but none of those reasons are he actually just needs help and he's struggling. And this viewpoint seems to be quite missed by the wider community, partly because we still see it as a criminal offence. So taking that into consideration, these disconnections happen really early, because if you're regarded as a criminal, your mum will feel ashamed that you're an addict. So she'll stop telling people about what's going on for you. You know what I mean? This further disconnects you from your own family, let alone the wider community. Then the wider community is viewing you the same way as well. So what this does is it isolates addicts. And if you're isolated inside a society, surrounded only by like-minded people, which is negative at this point, it's self-feeding. And until we change the understanding of what's really going on, because 80% of addicts are dealing with childhood trauma. So fundamentally we're not well. We don't know how to deal with our emotional state. We're ignored by the greater society, and we're ignored by any help really. You go to a doctor and as soon as he finds out you're on drugs, you're ignored, because they expect you to deal with the drug problem first before they'll deal with anything else. And it's catch-22, because you need the help before you can deal with the drug problem. And then you just lose faith in the whole thing, so you become a lot more isolated, and you're just going deeper and deeper into isolation. So this is why the bridge needs to be made of understanding. You know what I mean? And the more people that understand the makeup of an addict and what's going on for them, then you start seeing them as someone that just needs help, rather than someone that's just making shitty choices because they're a shitty person. So connection is what's needed.
To build bridges, we're going to need foundations. We're going to need interest and authenticity. We're going to need supports all the way along. We're going to need new ways of connecting. We're going to need a place to come from and a place to go. We're going to have to unlearn habits of a lifetime.
To build bridges, we're going to need to be curious to learn what's on the other side. On the other side of the bridge, we're going to find a different point of view.
To build bridges, we're going to need to get rid of some of our siloed ways of thinking,
throw off some of our egos and saviour complexes, let go of some of our anxieties, try to make some common language, and start naming power and difference and expertise and work together. In the words of an Aboriginal activist group from Queensland in the 1970s, if you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together.
To build bridges, we're going to need hope, courage, honesty, love. The stuff that bridges are made of: wood, stone, metal, hope, vision, a desire to reach the other side.
To build bridges, we're going to need clouds. On the other side, we're going to find your heart.
To build bridges, we're going to need to facilitate communication and establish relationships, bring people into contact with one another, overcome the barriers that hold us back, reinforcing so we can connect.
To build bridges, we're going to need a bigger boat. So firstly, yes, this is a silly reference to the movie Jaws, but more seriously, if we stick with your nautical theme and think about the boat as a metaphor for society, I think there's a bit more to say about the kind of society we want, which hopefully is one that's big enough to fit and support everyone who wants to be part of it, whether they're currently treading water or waiting on the dock with a ticket and dry shoes. A society that's big enough to overcome harm and find ways to foster trust and mutual aid between everyone on board. A society that doesn't imagine itself as surrounded and attacked by monsters who must be excluded at all costs.
We'll need to have patience, recognising that no one should have to live under the bridge, knowing that a bridge must be built from all sides, to meet in the middle, to let go, each other, trial and error.
I would find candy on a bridge, and it would lead to a winter candyland with lots of kids and babies playing and eating some candy that makes them small and then big, in a dream lovely land called Sweet Candy Crazy Land.
To build bridges, we're going to need a boat, because we have to get across to move people and stuff. We're going to need a lot of labour. And on the other side, and actually what is the other side? Because if we've got a boat and we're going backwards and forwards, sometimes it's this side, sometimes it's the other side, and sometimes this side is the other side. Anyway, but when we get there, we're going to find rest. Refuge.
On the other side, we're going to find a way to live a life free from trouble and strife, to understand our feelings and our emotions, and find new friends. A rainbow that arcs into the sky, where the sun is on my side and keeps me warm and dry.
And the bridges are going to have to be oxymoronic, built to be both strong and flexible, rigid and adaptive, magnificent and human-sized, built of past and future.
On the other side, we're going to find love, pain, hope and frustration, hardship, joy and emancipation.
To build bridges, we're going to need people who want bridges, people who know about bridges, people who want to look at bridges creatively, practically and philosophically.
It will not be easy, as these things never are, but we will look over our shoulder and acknowledge that every step forward was worth it.
To build bridges, we're going to need to put tension on the tightropes. I think of bridges as things that have complete stability at either end, where everything feels safe and good, but the bit in between is a risky bit, the bit where you're suspended and praying that you reach the other side safely. I think of that bit in between as, I guess, a series of tightropes. Some of the ropes are really narrow, you feel completely unstable and unsure if you've got the right balance or support to make it across, and then you just reach a slightly wider rope that gives you just enough safety to feel okay and to face the narrower tightropes that might still be ahead. But it's not until you're on the other side where the concrete is, that you feel safe. And when you're there, that's when you feel your heart stop racing quite as much as it maybe has been. And you can sit and relax and just look back at the tightropes you've crossed and just be proud that you made it.
The tension I felt holding me up.
To build bridges, we're going to need blood, sweat and tears. On the other side, we're going to find plasters, good sense of humour, good banter, and a bowl of soup.
Something in the way you move.
On the other side, we're going to find that, in the words of Hannah Arendt, we are only free when we are connected to others.
To be a bridge, we're going to need nuts, bolts, screws, and effort. Nuts, bolts, screws, efforts, and patience. To be able to see the other side. To want to go on a journey. The bridge isn't the destination. To build bridges, we're going to need someone on the other side. And what if besides the bridge, there's another bridge that takes you to the bridge when you fall from the bridge? And what if we end with a net of bridges so rich that living in between, connected, becomes the norm? Bridging as a way of life.
To build bridges, we need to, well, I don't know. And if I don't know and you don't know, then we have to discover together. We can learn together. And by doing that, maybe we find we don't need a bridge, because there's nothing to cross, there's no division, there's no separation, there's no difference. We're the same. And on the other side, we find there is no other side. Wherever you go, there you are. You're on this side. So same again, there's no division, there's no separation, there's nothing to cross. Yeah, that's about it. That's about all I can answer. Because I don't know. And not knowing is a good place to be. It creates space.
We walked the tightrope, watching over the land. Kept me floating. The tension I felt holding me up. I felt the lowest notes the most, hanging in the grey. You left behind a shadow, a shape, waiting for the daylight, the daylight, waiting for the daylight, the daylight, waiting for the daylight, the daylight, waiting for the daylight. Charcoal palm trees beyond the reach, closest to the post, and the space between us reaching out. I felt the lowest notes the most, hanging in the grey. You left behind a shadow, a shape. Waiting for the daylight, the daylight. 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 Waiting for the And when the light turns, where will we be? Blinking back the hope in a new country. And when the light turns in this place we see, we had